So, hello, welcome. I think we're expecting some more people, but they'll drift in at some point, no doubt. So, I think it's really wonderful that Ariane has sort of convened this. As the first female master of this college, I am very conscious of the gender dimension here. And of course, Churchill was the first college to vote to admit women out of all the colleges. So I came up in 1971 to read natural sciences when there wasn't any mixed colleges. So I went to Girton because I only had a choice of three. And I chose the one that was furthest away. And at that point, Churchill had already voted, but didn't admit women until 1972. So I couldn't really come. And it was obviously trailblazing, and I'm sure Professor Finch will say more about this. But what is interesting is that now we are only 30% women in this college. And it's something that troubles me. I know we are heavily into the STEM subjects. I myself am a physicist, but you know, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, we're 70% that by statute. But even so, I do not understand why we have such a particularly low intake of women. And one of the first things I did when I came here was try and look at some of our statistics. And it is clear that the proportion of women in the college in subjects like engineering is actually below the university average. So my challenge to all of you is to tell me what we're doing wrong. Why are people not applying to this college? Why are women not applying to this college in the numbers we'd expect? And what can we do? How can all of us sort of change the image which apparently 17-year-olds have of this college? So that's a challenge that I have very sort of publicly set out, that I feel we need to do better in this respect. So having an evening like this is a wonderful idea. Celebrating International Women's Day is a wonderful idea. It's quite clear that it's getting more and more traction around the world. And in Cambridge, there are various things going on. And again, if I think back to when I was an undergraduate, so there were only 3 colleges that girls could go to. And in my class, as a physicist, there were 8 girls out of 100 and a few in our final year at the end of natural sciences. And I naively thought that everything would be transformed very rapidly. When all the colleges went mixed, I thought, yes, we will find that we're moving towards 50-50, even in a subject like physics, and it simply hasn't happened. So there are many cultural issues that we have to face. But of course, in Cambridge, we're very privileged, and one should remember this is International Women's Day, and there are challenges all around the world, the most horrendous stories of using rape as a war crime. For instance, I was talking to Barbara Stocking, who used to run Oxfam, who were talking about it. There are many, many challenges. So in some ways, what we face here and the fact that there are only 20% girls doing physics A-level is relatively small fry. But nevertheless, it's your lives, it's your younger sisters' lives, as it were, that are impacted, and we must try and work out what we can do. From 2010 till the time I became master here, I was the university's gender equality champion. I did a lot of work with the pro-vice-chancellors, the vice-chancellors, to try and change the climate as far as we could. I certainly think I was pushing on an open door. I think Cambridge collectively is very responsive. However, we know perfectly well there are issues for the student population that need to be addressed. And if I could just slip in a sly remark before the alcohol arrives, I do worry that alcohol is part of the problem in our society here, that my impression is you young folk drink more than we used to. That may be an illusion. I may forget how much I used to drink, but I think it is something that we need to worry about. So for me, as master, the key thing is to try and make sure we are seen as a welcoming college for everyone, and that includes for girls. I want to raise the profile of what the women in this college can do, will do. I hope some of you have come to the conversations I've started this year with senior academics. There will be another one next term when I'm talking to Uta Frith, who is a neuroscientist very interested in autism and dyslexia. So that's my small way of just trying to say Churchill is about women just as much as it's about men. Please, we want to see more of you here. So there's a lot to be done. I certainly feel Churchill is an incredibly welcoming environment. Its history as an unstuffy college, which is what I was told when I first came, absolutely seems to be true. It's how I felt since I've been here. I've been here about as long as you lot, second years, well, you lot. And so I hope that we will see more women here in the future, and I hope that this is sort of the start of a longer term conversation about what we can do. I will now pass over to Professor Finch, who is, or was, the first female fellow in this college, I think. One of the first.
Well, thank you, Athene, for that very inspiring and moving speech. So as you've just heard, I was one of the first 3 women fellows of Churchill, and my subject's French literature. And it's great to be here tonight as we all celebrate International Women's Day. You sometimes hear 2 extreme assessments of where women are at in 2016. One is the claim that we're in the post-feminist era, that there's no need for feminism anymore. The other is that we've gone backwards and that many of the achievements of feminism have been destroyed, and that if anything, things are now worse for women than they were. Well, I don't agree with either of those positions. Is there really no need for feminism anymore? That's a selfish point of view. There are things we know still need putting right in the UK. Many of our brightest young women still aren't confident enough of their own abilities, and that may even include some of you here tonight. You're cleverer than you think. More widely, we still have shocking rates of violence against women in the UK. In England and Wales, 2 women a week are killed by a current or former partner. And what about women in other countries? As Athene referred to the use of rape as a war weapon, there are those who suffer acid attacks for rejecting unwanted suitors, or who like Malala Yousafzai, are shot just for wanting an education. What about female genital mutilation? Of course, that's a UK issue too. So no, feminism and the need for it aren't dead, neither nationally nor internationally. Now, the opposite point of view suggests that the clock has been turned back, that we've actually regressed. Of course, it can sometimes seem that way when the news tells us about dreadful activities both in the West and worldwide, like those of Boko Haram. But here we should take the long perspective and just think about what things were really like in the past. There's an interesting book by the Harvard academic Steven Pinker with the rather cheesy title, The Better Angels of Our Nature. I don't know if you've heard of it. But he argues that in the course of the last few hundred years, very gradually and despite some massive setbacks, not only the West but other areas of the world are becoming more humane. It seems counterintuitive, I know, but he mounts plausible arguments. And a linchpin of these arguments is the improved position and influence of women. Even countries like Saudi Arabia are showing signs of a shift in attitude, very small signs to be sure, but it would be as blinkered to deny them as to overemphasize them. Well, in both my research and in my own lifetime, I've become convinced that we should appreciate both what needs to change and what has changed. Take the relative view. I was going to take a few moments to tell you about the subject of one of my books called Women's Writing in 19th Century France, but with the imminent descent of wine and engineers, I'm not sure that we've got time for that. But just very briefly, I started off very puzzled by the phenomenon whereby a lot of 19th century English women writers are extremely well known today. You know, there's Mary Shelley with Frankenstein, Charlotte Bronte. A lot of them have been on the English syllabus for decades. There's never been any argument about it. You know, Jane Austen, Emily Bronte, George Eliot, they are universally recognized as great writers, world-class writers. And that's just wasn't the case in 19th century France, where, you know, there were a lot of very intelligent writers, very talented writers, but they just weren't recognized as such. And It's extraordinary, really. I mean, George Eliot took her George from a French novelist, Georges Sand, who's now mainly known as having been Chopin's mistress. I mean, no one now thinks she was a great writer. So anyway, I looked into the conditions and I found that the legal everything was worse for French women. I was slightly surprised by this, but legally, from the religious point of view, the educational point of view, it was all worse. And, you know, as for Girton, you know, where Athene went and where I went myself, that was founded in 1869 as the first Oxbridge higher education institution for women. Nothing like that in France, absolutely nothing. And the other very convincing and rather moving thing was that a lot of these French women writers looked to England. They said, well, look, England is a better place for women. England is a better place for women writers. They talked about their own lack of confidence, which I think is a key issue for women. They talked about their own lack of confidence. They even wrote poetry about their own lack of confidence. But anyway, yeah, so I won't go into that now. But anyway, the mention of Girton, Athene being there, myself being there, it brings me to my own modest little trajectory, which I think nevertheless does fit in the general picture of British women's education. So first of all, I'd never have got anywhere if I hadn't passed the 11+, which entitled me to have a grammar school education. In those days, there was only a tiny number of comprehensives, so if you failed the 11+, you went to what were called secondary modern schools, which meant you were doomed to a rather poor education and were very unlikely to go to university. But thankfully, I didn't know when I sat that exam that girls' marks in the 11+ were deliberately lowered. There were fewer grammar school places for girls than for boys, so more girls had to fail. In other words, there are a lot of women of my age who've gone through life thinking they were dumb because they failed the 11+, when really they should have passed. But the widespread introduction of comprehensive schools, removing in most regions the need for the 11+, changed that particular injustice. Now, the next thing, and this may be of interest to the STEM students here, and it does bear a bit on what Athene said about the difficulty still of getting girls to do sciences, although I think probably I've got a slightly Pollyanna-ish view of our progress since I was at school, but you'll be the judge of that. So anyway, at primary school, I loved science. I wanted to be a doctor. I also wanted to be a prima ballerina, but we'll draw a veil over that. Well, my parents were supportive and never once suggested I should be a nurse rather than a doctor. But when I got to my all-girls secondary school, I found the science teaching uniformly dull. My school may have been unusual, but I've heard similar stories from other women of my age, though of course Athene must have a different tale to tell about the teaching she got. But generally, there were rather few women in that older generation, the generation of Athene's mother and mine, your great-grandmothers, who'd done science degrees, and even fewer of those, I'd guess, went into teaching. Significantly, towards the end of my time there, my school finally admitted defeat, and shock horror took on its first male science teacher. In other words, they just couldn't find good women teachers. So I'd hazard a guess that the former dearth of good science teaching in many girls' schools is one reason why there are rather few senior role models for women around in the sciences now. But the situation had vastly improved. Here's where maybe I am, I'm taking this Pollyanna-ish view that I mentioned. It was my impression the situation had vastly improved by the time my own daughter and son got to secondary school in the 1990s. They both got charismatic science teaching from women as well as men. So in just a generation, things had shifted, but maybe not shifted quite far enough. Another reason for the paucity of older women in academia is that, for better or worse, an Oxbridge degree is often the start of a successful UK academic career in any subject. And until Oxbridge men's colleges started opening their doors to women, just 1 place in 10 was available for female students, and I do think we should phrase it that way, because I think somehow if you say, oh, there are 3 colleges here and 5 colleges in Oxford, it masks that fact which made my blood boil when I was 17 and still does. Just 1 place in 10. So if there are woefully few women professors around, that lack of Oxbridge opportunity when we were young probably contributed. Now that too has got much better, and again, I needn't take you through this again, Nathini has alluded to it. Churchill College did play a pioneering role. And furthermore, although there'd been a handful of opponents here, an overwhelming majority of the fellows was passionately in favour of this egalitarian move. I was told a story which did move me. The very first woman fellow came here actually a year before 1972, the official admission of women. They managed to squeeze her in. And when she walked into the governing body meeting, so I was told, some of the male fellows stood up and clapped. They were so moved and so passionate about this issue. And it was part of what made the atmosphere of the college and still makes it welcoming and supportive. But by contrast, I spent 10 years in another institution that shall be nameless, but it's a university in the Thames Valley. There, my college was Merton, and Merton, unlike Churchill, had been among the last Oxbridge male colleges to admit women. That meant I was mingling with colleagues who'd voted not just once, but several times against the admission of women, because, of course, those who favoured co-education kept bringing it back for discussion. I never knew which Merton Fellows had been the most strongly against co-education. They were all scrupulously polite. But one could guess, and it made a palpable difference to the atmosphere. And over the years, I came to despise the specious arguments that I heard put forward against the admission of women. They boiled down to the same subtext. We pretend to be committed to the life of the mind, but we want to place barriers in the way of 50% of the population, however intelligent they may be, simply because they're physically different from ourselves. And there may be varying views on positive discrimination, the perhaps over-enthusiastic attempt to reverse that balance, but I think we ought to get it in historical perspective. I had an outspoken female colleague who a few years after me became one of the first women fellows of St John's College, Cambridge. The master called the female fellows in at a certain point and said to them, "I understand you're unhappy because you think you may have been appointed just because you're women." I don't know if any of them had actually said this, but that's what he said. And my colleague replied, "No, it doesn't bother us. We know the male fellows of John's were appointed because they were men." And it was rude, but I guess she had a point. So to come back to Churchill, and here I'm getting towards the end. For many years, the number of women fellows stayed the same. 3, sometimes 4, then back to 3. But suddenly, the college started to acquire more in the 1990s. By the time I came back from exile in Oxford in 2003, the whole picture had changed. There were far more women fellows in both science and arts subjects. One year, a majority of the 5 junior research fellowships went to women. And that would have been unthinkable, really unthinkable when I started out here. More egalitarian admissions, postgraduate as well as undergraduate, meant that more women were coming through the system. And Churchill Fellows, at least, were becoming more aware of the unconscious sexism that can creep into assessments. And I'm going to give myself a little pat on the back here because I think I was the person who first, in the early 1990s, drew the college's attention to the studies that showed this unwitting bias. These studies demonstrated that if you sent out anonymized research to assessors, telling them that research paper X was by a man and paper Y was by a woman, even if they weren't, the pieces thought to be by men would generally be assessed 10% higher than those thought to be by women. And I'm afraid female as well as male assessors fell into this trap. 10% may not seem like much, but it could be enough to stop a woman getting that job or that grant. Well, to wind up, and as Athene said, there's more to do, but there were and are things to be proud of in the UK, and more locally, things to be very proud of here in Churchill. So let's enjoy our celebration this evening and look to the future as well.
I'm going to speak really quickly about this because my speech is going to pale in comparison to what we just heard. So yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about the charity we're all supporting today, which is what the proceeds of the film is going to go towards. So we've been researching into the WISE campaign, which is Women in Science, Engineering, Technology and Maths. Yeah, essentially. And basically, as part of that campaign, which was started in 1984, so it started in 1984 after the Forrester Report, which was basically observing the massive disparity between male and female workers in the engineering industries. So basically since then, and they did a little record in the millennium, which was essentially 7% of women versus 93% of men in engineering jobs in the millennium, which has now gone up to about 15%, but as we can all kind of see, that's nowhere near enough. As you would hope it to be. So as part of the WISE campaign, there's this new initiative which is called People Like Me. So this initiative is basically aimed at girls ages about 11 to 14 when they start high school. So the initiative is basically creating resources and information for teachers in order to look at the way that girls approach how they go about choosing GCSEs, A-levels, and then, of course, how they go into career prospects. Looking at the way they view themselves and how they address themselves with everyday language, adjectives, verbs, and see how they use these descriptions of themselves as to kind of what jobs they want to do and what careers they want to go into, and give them more confidence that their skills can be applied to the STEM subjects. So obviously this is something that's quite close to our hearts being here at Churchill, and I can't obviously say I'm a champion of this being an English student. However, it is really important to us, and as Dame Athene has stated out, and as we're all really aware, there is a big problem in getting female students to apply to Churchill and really to raise those numbers. So that's what we're here for. We're going to donate to that initiative and hopefully encourage and spread that campaign amongst secondary schools in the UK. So that's the charity that we're all working towards. And then also, just wanted to say that thank you all for coming, because as a Women's Society, it's really nice to see so many faces and so many people supporting this. Because it doesn't necessarily mean that, although there is kind of a large male to female ratio in Churchill, that doesn't mean to say that female voices need to be drowned out. And therefore we need to hopefully, as the years go on, keep working as a society to encourage people to discuss feminism and other things relating to people feeling comfortable as a gender in their college, in the university, and basically in any forum or area we go into. As we start moving into careers and working with different people that aren't as nice and welcoming necessarily as Churchill is as a college that obviously we're quite proud to be a part of. So yeah, thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy tonight. Pass you on to Oriane for a few minutes before we all start consuming the drinks.
So thanks a lot, for being here again and for all these great speeches we've just had. So, as some of you will know, it has now been about a month since I took over the role of Women's Officer. And 1 month, that means 4 times the opportunity to add to your overflowing mailboxes yet another bulletin. 1 month meaning 4 times having to sit in front of my computer to write that bulletin, now, gladly, of course. But also 4 times choosing whether or not to include that new F word, feminism, in the email. So I thought that for all the times I pressed erase when writing that bulletin, for all the times I had to pause to debate and justify to myself the use of that word, for all the times that feminism didn't pass the PR test, I would take the opportunity tonight to talk a little bit about feminism. Now, some will say, as Professor Finch has mentioned today, the feminism today is changing. Some will say that feminism is broken or disunited. The feminism has lost sight of its true priorities, but I want to say that feminism hasn't changed. We have. And because of the progress made by those who fought for gender equality before us, because our societies more generally are changing, because our means of communications are being revolutionized, from seeing and hearing and allowing one feminism, that of universal womanhood as corporeal experience, we are now in a measure to see and hear, though not always to accept, the plurality contained in feminism. Feminism in places like our university is no longer simply or only about safeguarding women's fundamental rights through laws and legislations, no longer simply about granting a universalized womanhood the status of citizen. Feminism is multifaceted, complex, and composite. Woman is multifaceted, complex, and composite. Woman both shapes and is shaped by the dozens of other elements in the matrix of our identities. Woman is a lived experience, a corporeal experience perhaps, but also a learned behavior and a personal truth. So the traditional enemies of feminism, sexism, misogyny, harmful gender stereotypes, do not stand alone. And in the matrix that determines where our voices and our opportunities stand in our societies, sexism does not stand alone. Which is why ever more than before, women should not stand alone in fighting for gender equality. And that's what we mean when we say that feminism is complex and multifaceted. Not that feminism is broken, not that it has lost its sense of direction. For feminism is about multiple voices coming together to form a single harmony, though that's not to say that there can't be a bit of disagreement here and there. Now, how does this relate to this university or to our college? Well, in our academic environment, and as we've talked about already today, inequality is found where you'd expect it. So whereas women comprise 55% of those within higher education in the UK, only 35% of female students study STEM subjects. But inequality doesn't stop there. It also hides where perhaps you'd have a tendency to forget it. In 2014, in this university, 91% of firsts in the Part 1 history tripos went to male students. In 2015, that was 80% of firsts. So feminism and the fight for gender equality can no longer and is no longer simply about achieving a purely quantifiable equality, for this is not enough. It is no longer simply about tolerating women in male institutions. Feminism is, on the short term, about putting in place structures that will guarantee that we as a society are moving towards obtaining and safeguarding gender equality in all areas of life and at all levels of society. That will guarantee the fundamental rights of all those who are victims of gender-based discrimination. That will guarantee their equal access to care, to education, to the workplace. That will ensure that their voices are heard. But feminism is also, and has always been, on the long term, about working towards making gender a positive source of diversity, as opposed to a set of normative categories. Feminism is about a qualitative, not just a quantitative revolution. It is about seeking, recognizing women's contributions as women, as friends, as students, as professors. It is about letting these women lay down the building blocks of our society and of our institutions, rather than simply letting them through the door. Feminism is about space, about taking up space, redistributing space, creating space, and shaping space. And this begins with communities of women, of course, but also communities of support, communities that inspire, such as the People Like Me campaign that Lucy has told you about and that we are going to be donating to this evening. Communities like our college that, as Dame Athene Donald has said, became the first all-male Cambridge college to open its doors to women, triggering a wave of reforms across this university. Our college, where, as you have heard today, students and fellows are constantly working to support women both inside and outside of this university. And this is why events like the one today are so important. Because events like these are about space. And events like these are about community, through the celebration of the achievements of women in our college, and through bringing together students, fellows, alumni, women and men. So before we move on to the reception and formal, which I think everyone is now expecting, I would also like to take this opportunity to say a big thank you to everyone who made this evening possible. To Dame Athene Donald and Professor Finch for chairing this event and delivering such inspirational speeches. Also to all those who helped organize the event, so Dr. Sally Boss, Mr. David Oakley and the catering team, Mrs. Naomi Morris, Mrs. Carol Robinson, and Mr. Chris Cummings for AV. And finally, a big thank you to all of those who left their work back in the library or the office tonight to attend this celebration, which I hope will be the first in a series designed to promote and celebrate gender diversity in our college as we progress along this path.